Hello and good morning. Thank you everyone for being here with us today on this last day of the North Carolina Council of Churches Legislative Seminar. I hope you enjoyed the hymn by David Lamont as you joined us in the Zoom. We are very proud of that hymn. Just like they do on the first day of classes, I also just wanted to say that this is our second to last seminar on public education. So if you are in the wrong Zoom room, this is your chance to sneak out. But we also invite you, if you're going to stay with us, to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you are in the state. Let us know your pronouns, what organizations or faith communities you are affiliated with. We also want to remind you that if you need closed captioning, there should be a button towards the bottom of your screen that has 2 C's on it. And if you click it, you should be able to read along as we go. Let us know if you have any issues with that in the chat. And we will be collecting any questions that you may have. So please add them to the chat and we will bring them up during the question and answer session after the presentation. My name is Michelle Peden. I use she, her, and ella pronouns. I'm the program coordinator for our Partners in Health and Wholeness team at the North Carolina Council of Churches. I'm currently in Durham, North Carolina. And on that note, I do want to open our time with a land acknowledgement. This land that we reside within and depend upon is the stolen land of Indigenous people taken through forced removal and colonialism. North Carolina holds the largest Indigenous population east of Oklahoma, and acknowledging our Indigenous neighbors in addition to the reality of our history is one of the ways that we seek to do justice and walk a path toward accountability and solidarity. I will uplift that where I live in Durham, North Carolina is the occupied land of the Shakori, Bino, and Tuscarora people. If you know the name or names of the people whose land you call home, I invite you to share their names in the chat. If you do not know, this is an invitation to learn about the land that you occupy. We would like to pay our respects to all those we have named in the chat, to their elders, past and present, and to honor their connection to the land, water, and community. Thank you for honoring these communities with us today. We are so excited to have Bryan Proffitt from the North Carolina Association of Educators with us today. And because the past decade has brought a new era of school segregation in North Carolina, and because the North Carolina Council of Churches has a long history of support for racial justice, we are committed to supporting a public school system that is built on racial equity and excellence for all students. In 1986, we reaffirmed our support for the system of public education in North Carolina, being a system of our government financed by public funds, responsive to the community as a whole and open to all without distinctions as to race, creed, national origin, or economic status. In 2006, the council again reaffirmed our support for the public schools as one of society's primary vehicles for social, racial, and economic justice. We call on our member denominations and congregations to speak out for racial and economic justice for our public schools. We call on our elected leaders at the state and local levels to stop creating policies that promote resegregation of schools and to provide adequate funding to the public schools, especially those affected by the Leandra decision, which called on the NCGA to adequately fund public education, regardless of zip code, all of which I'm sure we'll learn about shortly more with Bryan. And to read more about our public education statement and resources, check out our website at the ncchurches.org. Now, as I get ready to turn it over to Bryan Proffitt is the Vice President of the North Carolina Association of Educators, has been committed to organizing and equity work since before he began his teaching career, but his long-term fight for the schools our students deserve was sparked by his experiences in the classroom. In this workshop, Bryan speaks to the current state of North Carolina public schools and what residents of our state can do to advocate for positive legislation during the 2021-2022 legislative cycle. I'm handing it over back to Bryan.
Awesome, thanks, Michelle. I am going to share my screen now and use this Google slideshow as a set of notes for us to follow along with, and I will In fact, let me do it now real quick before I start so that people don't feel like they need to scramble to take notes or anything like that. So I'm gonna just real quick, if anybody is interested, I'm going to drop in the chat right now. Um, Maybe if I can get it to pull up. I'm gonna drop in the chat. Just kidding. I will in a little bit. And maybe Michelle, I gave you access to it, so I don't know if you wanna drop in the chat so that people can see it. That would be super helpful because for some reason my chat function is not opening for me to be able to put things in it. So that technical difficulty aside, good morning, everyone. It's really, really lovely to be here with y'all today. And what I would like to do, what I was hoping to start with, was to ask you all, as a classroom teacher, I feel pretty clear that it's difficult to try to work with a set of folks that you know nothing about. So I would love it if you all would drop in the chat, and I'm hoping I'll be able to figure out a way to access it in a second. Your name, where in the state you're joining us from this morning, and then something just briefly about what public schools mean to you. And while y'all are doing that, maybe what I'll do is quickly stop my screen share so I can see those things. And this is going to be one of those where if you all came here thinking that I was just going to talk the whole time and you did not have to participate in any way, I'm sorry to inform you that that's not how this class works today. So thank you for Libby from Greensboro, who's a retired public school teacher. So awesome. Oh, Libba, rather. Thanks for your work, Libba. Michelle says public school made her who she is. Absolutely. Elizabeth in Durham wouldn't be here without Greensboro Public Schools. Brenda from Winston is a retired school teacher. Garnett is a retired educator. So here's the thing: we got to apparently, there are way more educators out there than we know of, and everybody knows and loves someone who was or is at some point an educator, even just here in this call, right? James, good morning, James. Good to see you, buddy. Public schools mean how we come together as a society to lift everyone up. Um, Awesome, awesome. Maybe I'll just see if a couple quick. Sarah went to public schools all the way through college. Suzanne is the daughter of an educator. Awesome. Thanks for jumping in and providing those things, y'all. And Reverend Dobson in New Bern, where I graduated from New Bern High School. Hello, Reverend or Dr. Dobson, who's working with kids. So good to be in a space with you all. And I'm going to now jump into this presentation. That the goal is to yes, help to give people a context of some of the immediate things that we're facing in North Carolina public schools, but actually to draw a longer arc and put the story inside of a bigger historical picture. Um, the first thing I want to do, however, is just take a moment. I'm sure that you all have been paying attention to the news over the course of the last week. And one more incident of an unarmed Black person being murdered by the police. And so, what I'd like to do, if possible, is just start with a brief 20-second moment of silence where folks can think about Andrew Brown Jr. and his family, any of the folks that you have already had holding in your heart around these tragic and violent losses, and any hopes or dreams that you have about living in a world where this doesn't happen anymore. So let's just take a few moments of silence just to start. Thanks, everybody. And while it is unfortunate that this is the context that many of us know the name Andrew Brown, I think it's really important to acknowledge that without the role of movements, right, we wouldn't, most of us wouldn't know the name of Andrew Brown in the same ways that we wouldn't know the name of George Floyd or Trayvon Martin or Sandra Bland or any of the countless number of people who we're now aware of because of the role of movements. In the same way, right, that some of the most vicious and egregious manifestations of Jim Crow we became aware of socially as a result of the work of movements, right? In the same way that lots of people got more firsthand knowledge and a better understanding of the horrors of slavery, right, because of the movement to end it, right? So one of the things that I want to really foreground and talk about quite a bit throughout my presentation today is going to be about the role that movements play in building the kind of society that we want. And so the movement that I most currently find myself situated in and closely to, I think would be what people call kind of broadly the Red for Ed movement, which if you can, if you all have been paying attention, you can go back to the occupation of the state capitol in Wisconsin in 2011 in response to attacks on public infrastructure there. You can look at the really groundbreaking Chicago's teacher strike in 2012, led by one of my personal heroes who we lost this year, Karen Jennings Lewis. Move forward, obviously, into the mass strikes that happened in West Virginia, Arizona, across the country back in 2018. And so this movement of educators being with each other, being with our students, being with our parents, wearing red as a symbol of trying to demonstrate just what the level of danger, what the level of anger is out there that's around the condition of our public schools is part of what is the context that lets me be able to speak to you all today. Because obviously we've taken our cues and our leadership and have built ourselves something like a Red for Ed movement. So I was excited to see some folks jumped on here in their red today. If you want to be part broadly of this movement in North Carolina, you should know that every Wednesday, we wear red across the state. So, and if you your Facebook feeds and you got educator friends, you should see them usually wearing red on Wednesdays. So what I want to say about this movement to defend and transform public schools is that it's incredibly important that in the context of the movement for Black Lives, we've been having a much more, I think, present and public discourse about a movement to end racism in our society. And so lots of the attention in that conversation has been about the question of police and prisons and criminal justice. But I want to offer here today that I think that the movement to defend and transform public schools is an anti-racist movement, right? And like all anti-racist movements, it actually benefits everyone in the state, no matter people's racial identity, Black, brown, white, Native, immigrants, right? Across the board, it's an anti-racist movement, and it benefits everybody. So the other thing that I want to add just quickly as context in situating our Red for Ed movement here in North Carolina is, are any of y'all, and I'll look in the chat to see if I can see any hands raised or so they're in the chat. Were any of you all with us on May 16th of 2018 on this historic day when we shut down over 50 school systems in the state? Or the following year, May 1st, 2019, when we shut down about 40 school systems in the state and put tens of thousands of people in the street. I'm not super able to, I see Sarah saying that her mother was there. Suzanne was there. I know you were there, Suzanne. And hopefully you all, even if you didn't have a chance to be on the ground with us, you were able to follow what was happening. And this is my favorite photo of the day. And the reason why my favorite photo of May 16th, 2018 is this one is because that building that's there in the center. Can somebody come off mute real quick and tell me what that building is that you see in the center? Somebody knows. Oh, y'all gonna be shy today.
It's a state capitol, North Carolina State Capitol.
Yes, it is. It's actually the historic state capitol. It's where the governor's office is currently, right? But it is the old legislative building. And so what feels really, really important for me about this photo on this day was the fact that our folks kind of claimed this building, kind of claimed that ground, claimed that space. And that space is really significant because that's the space where the Constitution of 1868 was written, right? And what's really, really important about the Constitution of 1868 is when we talk about the Leandro case and we talk about the constitutional foundation for people having a right to public schools in North Carolina, that begins with the Constitution of 1868, which says that North Carolina had to have a taxpayer-funded public school system. So the timing of that, y'all, is not a coincidence, right? Because if we talk about 1868, we have to talk about Reconstruction. And what Reconstruction was the movement that after the Civil War, right, that was about how do Southern states, essentially being forced and resourced by the federal government, invest heavily in schools, healthcare, housing, jobs, building infrastructure, and building a public life in a way that did not exist in the South prior to Reconstruction, right? So if we talk about a heavy investment in public healthcare, public jobs, schools, right, housing, who benefits from those things? Somebody want to throw it in the chat or say aloud, coming off of mute, who benefits from an increased investment in healthcare, in housing, in jobs, in public schools?
Everyone.
The most
Yes.
vulnerable, especially.
That's the answer I was looking for, everyone. And with a particular emphasis, right, on folks that are the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, but everyone benefits from an investment in those things. And if you are in the Reconstruction South and the government is forcing taxpayer dollars to be used to change the society in this way, who is losing?
No one.
Well,
White supremacist.
yeah, right. Really wealthy white Southerners were actually having power shifted away from them in this context in a way that benefited Black people, all Black people, and the majority of white people in the South, because the majority of the white people in the South have always been working class and poor, right? So that's who wins from these investments in Reconstruction. And the people who lose are the wealthy white Southerners who had created a system that had kept people divided and disempowered for the entire time. Right. So what's really important to name is that in these moments like Reconstruction, we can have a conversation about what it means to think about what's good for everybody together. And when we start putting money and policies into place that benefit the majority of people, then those majority of people begin to see some self-interest that they share with each other, in a way that the way that wealthy people and folks who are in control of our society are always trying to do is help us to try to, be apart from each other and not understand ourselves as the same. So the solutions that those wealthy white Southerners crafted, right, was to build a new regime of white supremacy, was to use instruments like the mass media and public performances to tell stories and paint pictures of who Black people were and what the dangers of integration were. Right? They built an entire paramilitary organization called the Ku Klux Klan, the red shirts, the white shirts throughout the South. They built a military, right, to oppose this way in which people were beginning to understand themselves as similar, right? And here in North Carolina, right, the ugliest part of this legacy is the Wilmington Massacre that occurred in 1898. And if there's, if anybody is interested in really taking up a story about the ways that multiracial movements were changing the South in the late 1800s and the ways that violence was used to destroy those movements, you couldn't come up with a better study than what happened here in Wilmington, North Carolina, right? So for those who don't know, kind of shorthand, right, is there was a violent coup that was essentially orchestrated from the office of the person who was running for governor, with coordination with the News and Observer as the main vehicle for news at the time, right? And there was a violent coup that burned down the Black press in Wilmington, ran a bunch of really powerful Black economic and political leaders out of town, and really, really crushed the movement, the fusion movement that had been building out of Reconstruction as poor white people and Black people were understanding themselves to have the same causes. So with that defeat of Reconstruction, you see the rise of Jim Crow, right? And so when we go back to this question of who benefits, right, and who loses, it's really, really important to kind of get down a little bit deeper into the details around these things, because there's a story about Jim Crow being for the benefit of white people, right, and against and towards the oppression of Black people and other people of color. But I think we actually need to take a more complicated of understanding of it, right? Because when we went into this period of Jim Crow, and we moved away from the multiracial, more connected version of society that was emerging in Reconstruction, what we saw was Jim Crow schools, right? And Jim Crow schools weren't good for Black kids, but let's be really, really clear, y'all, Jim Crow schools weren't good for poor white students. They weren't good for other students of color and immigrant students. They weren't good for girls. They weren't good for kids with disabilities. They weren't good for LGBTQ kids, right? So across the gamut, no one really wins in a Jim Crow schooling system unless you are somebody who has resources to be able to kind of escape it on your own. And so you have this phenomenon of quote unquote separate but equal, but the reality is that it is separate, it is unequal, and almost everybody is struggling inside of it, right? We need to be really, really clear that the sort of possibilities for poor white people in the South during Reconstruction came really screeching to a halt in a lot of ways once the Jim Crow regime was introduced. So, like, you know, anytime there's systematic oppression, people organize a response to it, right? So there was a movement to end Jim Crow that was led, obviously, and most centrally by Black people in the South, but that lots of other people around the country joined in, right? But you all know this as well as I do, that the movement to end Jim Crow schools was really central to the movement to end Jim Crow. And so what you get during this period of a movement to end Jim Crow, really from the 1930s to the 1960s, is we see heavy government investing in healthcare, in housing, in jobs, in public schools, in social services and infrastructure, right? And we begin to see the dismantling of the Jim Crow state and the investment in all of these things. And you all will not be surprised that my next question is, who is going to benefit when we have increased funding put into healthcare, housing, jobs, public schools, et cetera? Probably a broken record at this point, but who's benefiting?
Everyone.
Pretty much everybody, except for a small set of economic elites that want to make sure to keep us separated so they can continue to make money, right? So working class people across racial lines, right? This doesn't mean that there wasn't, you know, racism inside of how the New Deal was rolled out, or society all of a sudden became an incredibly anti-racist place, right? But the impact of these investments was felt across race, right? Among the overwhelming majority of people in this country. So again, you have the conditions that get created where the majority of people in this country, white, Black, brown, right, are understanding themselves, having their interests more aligned, right, and realizing that there's a set of people who are trying to keep them unaligned from each other. And so if we look deeper into the ways that this dismantling of Jim Crow impacted schools, we see the Brown versus the Board decision. We see Title IX, which is about allowing access to more educational opportunities for girls and women. We see the IDEA, which is really the first time there's any resources put into addressing the needs of students with disabilities. And we see increased federal funding, right, which has never been a big part of how we do education in the United States during this period. So you see these gains, right, that are the result of a Black-led movement, but obviously have an impact far beyond that and impact people positively across racial lines. So, right, what we know is that wealthy elite conservatives, right, particularly in the South, but across the country, really, really worked to try to figure out, how do we divide people from each other and how do we destroy these movements? So you see constant public attacks on Dr. King in every way imaginable, including red baiting and saying you don't want to associate with yourself with this person because he's a communist, right? You see someone like Bull Connor, who was the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, who was so deeply committed, not just in the notion of white supremacy, but just the profound separation of people from each other. Because that's part of the thing, right? Is if we have desegregated schools and we build relationships with each other, in particular, people who are middle class, working class, and poor, right? They can't tell us lies about who each other is. So that's one of the advantages of a public school system, is the ability to connect with each other and build meaningful relationships in a way that the folks who are trying to keep us at the bottom can't divide us if we have better relationships and we understand each other better. If we're always divided and we don't know each other, it's much easier to tell us lies about each other. So what you see is this movement that is orchestrated from the top, because that's who it benefits, right? But through mass media, through mass organization, is translated down in a way that communicates to poor and working class white people that something is being taken away from you, right? So instead of helping people to understand the context, the reality, which was that the more desegregation we had, the further we were from Jim Crow, the better everybody, including white people in the South, were going to be, right? That's not what the narrative was. And wealthy white elites took this opportunity to use mass media to drum up fears about what integration would mean. And we saw really, really ugly and violent resistance to desegregation, not just in the South, like in Little Rock, Arkansas, you can see on the left, but also in Boston, Massachusetts, and throughout the country, where everywhere they were talking about these fights, there was the influence of elite white conservatives who would push to try to communicate to communities, particularly white communities, that something was being taken away from them, right? So when the folks on the bottom are getting together, right, folks on the top get nervous about that. And so one of the things that we always talk about inside of NCAE is that we don't have the resources, right, that an Art Pope, that a Bill Gates, that anybody who's trying to change how our schools, we don't have those resources available to us. What we have is our organizations. Organizations are the places in which working class people can connect with each other across race lines to build the kind of power that we need, that ultimately is the power that works best for everybody in society, right? And so our opponents know that. And so part of their response, right, again, in this moment when things are getting a little bit scary for them because people are getting together, is to actually do the work of destroying our organizations. Because if they could destroy our organizations, right, then they could weaken our power, right? Hopefully some of you all saw this film that came out about Fred Hampton in the last few months. I believe it's called Judas and the Black Messiah. It tells a really remarkable story about a young Black Panther leader in Chicago who was really doing work to connect poor white communities, Puerto Rican communities, Black communities in Chicago, and was murdered in cold blood while he slept at the age of 21, right? We see attacks from the Reagan administration on unions, right, by firing all the striking air traffic control workers. So all of these things were wealthy elites looking at the movements that were bringing people together and making these gains and figuring out how do we destroy those movements. So just like super quick representation of that, if you look at unionization in the United States, which was never something that was particularly powerful with respect to the rest of the industrial world, you see a massive, massive drop during this time period in the late 60s, early 70s, as we've dismantled Jim Crow, and unions played a critical part in dismantling Jim Crow, right? We see this massive loss of density inside of the union movement in a way that we haven't really recovered from since. So what you see, while you see the movement that is ending and burying and putting the institutional nature of Jim Crow to bed, we see the regime and how we talk about racism shift, right? So it was no longer open, it was no longer possible in the same way that it had been during Jim Crow to be openly and defiantly racist and just say whatever you want to whoever you want, wherever you want, right? There had to be this kind of shift that elites used to talk about racism in ways that didn't signal to people, to everybody, as blatantly that that's what they were talking about. So you see this shift to talking about law and order, right? Which was a code for let's lock up all these rebellious people who were out there, in particular these Black people after the most of the urban riots in the 1960s. You see attacks on affirmative action and saying to white people, these people are trying to take something from you, right? And you begin to see this emergence of these charges of reverse racism, Let's focus on diversity in the workplace rather than talking about power. And what they're doing with this is they are doing the work again of going to white people and saying, right, we're better off over here by ourselves, right? Rather than being part of this movement that is in the mix with everybody else. And so that's what we've been really living inside of for about the last 40 or 50 years, right? Is this shift, right, in how we frame policies that are ultimately about racism and division, right, as something that is something else, right? So you can kind of see a through line from the Nixon slogan of law and order to Ronald Reagan talking about making America great again, to Donald Trump. And I swear it's literally the same slogan, y'all. Like, I didn't even know that was true until I was putting together this presentation a couple years ago. Is like literally the same slogan, 1980 and 2016. So you can see a through line around these policies. And again, no one is saying openly, let's do this thing and keep Black people in their place, right? Black and brown people in their place. But what they are saying are these codes that are saying to white people, someone is trying to take something away from you, right? And so what we enter into is this new period where we see policy shifts that are about huge tax cuts for the wealthy, right? Framed as job creation, reductions in investment in public housing, welfare, healthcare. You see the proliferation of low-wage jobs. You see an increased investment in prisons, police, and the military through the war on drugs, the war on communism, et cetera, and the starting to shift power back to states where they felt like they had a little bit more control. And so what we've seen over the course of the last year is we've seen the prison population, for example, grow from about 300,000 to about 2.5 million today, right? We've seen a widening of what people call this achievement gap, right? That is a result of this shift in investment. And we see a goal being the privatization of literally every aspect of American life, right? This is a political movement that starts to gain traction in the 70s, really comes into power in the 80s, and we've seen it impact both parties ever since. But here's the problem with public schools, though. If you want to privatize everything, just like that question I asked you all in the beginning about what public schools mean to you, all of us went to public schools, or our mamas taught in them, or our grandmothers taught in them, right? And we have these connections to public schools. So if you ask Americans, right, how they want to invest taxpayer resources, even in the places where you have most eroded support for lots of other public parts of our public economy, public schools always remain as something that people want to put a high investment in. So it becomes really, really hard to just eliminate something or privatize something if the majority of the public is in favor of it. So what they realized they needed to do if they were going to privatize public schools was to start shifting the ideas and start shifting how people thought about public schools. So in the early 80s, you see Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education write this terrible document called A Nation at Risk that just kind of begins this echo chamber of public schools are failing, public schools are failing, public schools are failing, public schools are failing. And if public schools are failing, then you begin to make the argument, right, that you need to defund schools, right? So it's interesting to see everyone throwing up, so much resentment and anger about the notion of defunding police over the course of the last year, when we've had no problem defunding public schools for the last 40 years. And so what they start to do inside of that is they start to tell that story, not just to people inside of their own base, but they use this story of the achievement gap and the failing urban schools to convince chunks of people who used to be in support of the movement to end Jim Crow. Now they've gotten those folks involved. So if you look in this photo, when George W. Bush is signing No Child Left Behind, right over his right shoulder, you see Ted Kennedy, who is one of the most liberal stalwarts, right, of the 20th century American political landscape. And he is signing a law that essentially transfers billions of dollars from public schools into private test companies, right, as a way to justify the continued defunding of schools. So what we see is this notion that we have to measure things, right? And the way we measure them is through these standardized tests. And so we see No Child Left Behind, We see the Obama administration coming with Race to the Top, and we see these school grades, which really all these things are about how do we put numeric evidence, right, and quantitative data on this story of the failing public schools. So you take a profession that, I don't know, some of y'all said you were retired educators, so you can attest to this. It's a real hard job, y'all. And a lot of people have a hard time sticking in the job, even under really great conditions. So if you put higher demands on folks, lower our salary and benefits, and constantly publicly shame people about how they are not doing good work, you are going to see a shortage, right? So great, they've got a solution for that, right? They bring in an organization like Teach for America, right? Which is a private organization, right? That they use as sort of a stopgap solution. So there's all these different mechanisms in which they have been working to tell this story of public schools failing and then sliding in more privatization and more resources being put towards the transfer of money out of public schools into private hands. So once you can demonstrate that public schools are failing, then we talk about school choice or educational freedom or parental rights or democracy or the free market, right? None of these things say explicitly what it is that they're doing, which is defunding public schools, putting money into the hands of people who are trying to make profit off of our schools, right? And further dividing us from each other. Right. So when we say, when that set of folks talks about education reform, what they mean is defunding. What they mean is deregulation. They mean resegregation. They mean attacks on teachers' unions, and they mean the proliferation of school choice, right? And all of these things, right, are being pushed by the same people who promote mass incarceration, gentrification and segregation of our housing, ICE raids and the deportation of our kids and their families, dismantling labor laws and welfare protections, limited access to healthcare, and restriction of the vote. So people who are passing these policies, we're supposed to believe them that they deeply care about the impacts and performance of Black and brown students in our public schools. Right? So we want to talk about the racial achievement gap in schools because we have the number to prove that, but we don't talk about these gaps that exist in every single part of our life, right? I know you all have been attending workshops all week about each of these items, right? So in every single one of these items, there's a massive discrepancy in life outcomes, right? And possibilities between white people and people of color, right? Between wealthy people and poor people, but we don't talk about those gaps. We talk about them as though they start and end in our public schools, right? So the real goal of these folks telling this story, right, about the failing public schools, if it's not because they want to have better outcomes for Black and brown kids, then it must be about the elimination of public schools, right? At its core, this is an argument to eliminate public schools. And just to be clear with y'all, it is not something that they are intending to do or trying to do. It's something they've done, right? On the backside of Hurricane Katrina, there are literally zero public schools remaining in New Orleans, in the city of New Orleans today. There are charter schools, right, which are publicly funded private schools, but there are no public schools left in the entire city of New Orleans today. So it's actually something that they have effectively been able to carry out. And the goal of all of it, y'all, is that you cannot make money off of public schools. There's no place for profit in that system. But if you incorporate a testing regime, if you bring in charters, if you bring in vouchers, if you bring in these education consultants, right, to dismantle your system, all those things have opportunities for someone to make profit that don't currently exist in the system. And in North Carolina, what this looks like is a pretty significant departure from what most of us who grew up in North Carolina or started our teaching careers in North Carolina, right, started in a different place where North Carolina was investing in K-12 public schools, where we built a world-class university system, where there was a pre-K initiative that served as a model for what the whole country was doing, right? For 20, 30 years, there's a consensus in North Carolina that these are the things that we invest in, right? Until we get to the recession in 2008. Right. And what we see is the Democratic government of the state start to say, well, we're going to cut schools during this recession, not make sure that that impact also hits wealthy people who are benefiting from the recession. Right. Then North Carolina had the audacity to elect the first Black president in 2008. And so what happened was conservative forces around the country said, no, we are not losing North Carolina to this moment and this movement. And so what you saw was a heavy investment in infrastructure and the ability to win elections, so that starting in 2012, we got an ultra conservative electoral victory, right, in both the House and the Senate in North Carolina. Then you saw the consolidation of that with the election of Governor Pat McCrory and supermajorities in both houses. So what you saw between 2013 and 2017 was nonstop defunding of our schools, the elimination of thousands of teaching assistant positions, the expansion and growth of charters, the elimination of due process rights for educators, a standard on our teacher evaluation that was tied to the test performances of our kids. You've seen the expansion of vouchers. You've seen schools getting these ugly F and D letter grades. You see the elimination of a teaching fellows program, which kept people in the profession, and replacing it with the temp agency, Teach for America, right? Now, y'all, if you enter North Carolina right now to be an educator this year, and you teach and you spend 35 years working with students in the state of North Carolina, you will not have healthcare coverage in your retirement. They've now eliminated that, right? So what you see, right, is this massive onslaught for 4 years, right, that we're still kind of trying to figure out how to deal with as the political landscape has shifted a little bit, and trying to figure out how our union, how NCAE could respond in a way that would change the dynamics. So what we've been doing is we've spent the last, 5-10 years trying to figure out how to organize in different ways, right, from these massive shutdowns that we've built, from trying to interact with elections in more meaningful ways, to trying to take on local issues in ways that connect our people even greater to each other, right? Because it feels really, really clear that with these segregationist forces in charge of our state legislature, that there's a very, very small number of people in North Carolina who benefit, and the overwhelming majority of us are taking really significant hits, right? But if we look at organizing around schools in North Carolina, you'll see more opportunity than just about any other sector, in my estimation, because in 97 out of 100 counties, school systems are the number 1, 2, or 3 employer, right? There's somewhere in the range of 150-ish thousand public school employees in the state. There's 1.5 million public school students, each of whom has an adult that cares about them. So if you think about creating an agenda around high quality public schools for all students, right, from across economic backgrounds, white students, Black students, brown students, you can begin to see the potential power that exists inside of a movement to change education, right? And so that's what we feel like the real potential is if we talk about public schools and their centrality and their importance, that there's a whole lot of fish that we can unite around this program. So we've seen it happen, right? If those of y'all that remember May 16th and May 1st, it was literally the entire state in those streets of Raleigh on those days. And so there's a tremendous amount of potential if we look at the question of education and organizing around education to really unify all of our folks, right, across race in particular, in ways that people in power in this state don't want us to do. So I'll drop these chats in the link, links in the chat at the end, or perhaps Michelle, if you have access to the document, you could drop those in now. So here is immediately inside of the context of this legislative session, what our priorities are. Spoiler alert, it's everything. We need all the things because they've taken all the things from us and we're just trying to get back to zero. Another document that would be great if you threw in the chat, Michelle, is this website for this RV tour that we've been traveling around the state, visiting every single county over the course of 20 weeks and trying to connect with students and parents and educators and uplift the powerful stories of the great things that are happening in our school. And then finally, and not insignificantly, everybody on this call could be a member of NCAE, right? So active membership in NCAE is for active educators, but anybody in the state of North Carolina, in fact, anybody in the whole world, can be a supporter member, a community ally of NCAE. And so that link is another one that I would love it if you would drop in the chat, Michelle, and would really, really encourage and appreciate folks to join us today. So that's all I got for now. I'm glad to take questions. I know we've got about 15 minutes left. And I will stop sharing my screen and kick it over to you, Michelle, to see if there's questions that you want to start a conversation with. And if not, I can pose some questions and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Brian. Wow, that was a lot, but I learned a ton. We do have a couple questions, and I have a couple questions that I'm also just curious about. We have one question that was earlier on, and it says, I have 2 grandchildren who are autistic, and why is it so difficult to find adequate public education for children with disabilities?
I mean, I think because we live in a society that doesn't respect people with disabilities. I mean, I think you could, I mean, I think part of what I think is an important question to ask is every single time that we talk about what are the ways in which public schools don't provide adequate resources around an issue, we should then ask that question about every other part of society and see if it lines up, right? My suspicion is that living with a disability in the world is pretty hard no matter where you are, right? And that actually public schools are some of the only places where we have dedicated resources and regulations and policies that even attempt to mitigate some of the disparities that exist there. So I think that's one of the things that I want to raise up is like part of the challenge, right? Is that it's very, very easy to talk about the ways in which public schools are failing, right? Because they are. They've been underfunded for decades. They were, in lots of ways set up to fail, right? And but because it's a public institution, we actually have the data to back up that they're failing, right? Because we've privatized everything else, we don't have that same kind of data, right? So it's really easy to say that the public schools are not meeting this need because we have the metrics that demonstrate it. But I don't know of any other place in our entire society where, take for example, and again, it doesn't always work well, right? But if you take, for example, a student going into a public school with a disability, right? There are staff people who are dedicated to trying to figure out effective strategies to work with that kid. There are staff people who meet with that student's families and try to help them come up with, like, that doesn't exist anywhere else in society. So is it insufficient? And are we coming up short of meeting those students' needs? 100%, right? And right now, it's literally the only place we're even trying to meet those needs. So I think that feels like an important thing to hold up as well.
One of my best friends is actually a special education teacher in Chatham County, and she's having to kind of absorb the workload of teachers who aren't staying, who are leaving halfway through the year. So yeah, great points. Thank you. We do have another question. Could you speak about the current curriculum decisions put forth by NCGAL? As a former reading specialist, I'm concerned about legislators making decisions about the best way to teach children to read.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole host of conversations right now about curriculum, from the kind of phonics reading discussion that's happening to the work that the Mark Robinson, Lieutenant Governor, is doing to try to talk about this profound left-wing indoctrination that's happening in all of our schools because of these rampant communist school teachers running around and trying to teach our kids to hate the United States, right? So there's a whole host of conversations that are happening right now about what should be taught in our schools that don't have educators at the center of them, right? And so, I think more than anything, if you talk about one of the impacts of North Carolina being a state that doesn't allow public sector workers to collectively bargain, it means that there's no official context through a union, right, for educators to be at the table to make these kinds of decisions. So all of it is sort of dependent on who's the state superintendent at this time, or which legislator, runs the education committee, right, to decide whether or not they want educators to be at the table. There's no binding anything that mandates that educators have to be at the table to make decisions about public schools, right? In a way that is just really, if we want to talk about a professional workforce, if we want to say that educators are professionals, right? You can't become a doctor without going to a medical school that is certified by the AMA, The AMA is the union of doctors. You can't get a law degree without going to a law school that is certified by the Bar Association, right? That's the union of lawyers, right? Why do we think about people who dedicate their entire lives to this craft of helping kids learn, right? We deprofessionalize that and act like there's decisions about that should be made by somebody else. My suspicion about that is that it has a lot to do with it being a caring profession that is mostly carried out by women, right? And so the kinds of expertise that people who work in public schools develop are not considered expertise by so many people, I think, because of how sexism frames what it is that happens in public schools. But, you know, I'm a high school teacher, and I'll tell y'all, I've never learned how to do it myself, but those kindergarten and first and second grade teachers who teach kids how to read, it is a magical phenomenon, right? And it is something that if you've never learned how to do it, right, you couldn't possibly conceive of it if you were taking yourself seriously as a task that is easy or someone, you know, kind of just anyone can handle this, right?
We have a couple comments and questions about charter schools. So I'm going to put a couple together because it kind of goes together. So I had a question about how to have conversations with people who feel like some charter schools create more diverse student bodies. And then in addition to that, the pros and cons of lumping together public charter schools, nonprofit charter schools with private schools, and how to kind of understand that.
Yeah, I feel like this is a pretty complicated and nuanced conversation that I feel like sometimes I'll present something in a way that makes it sound much flatter than it actually is. And I think part of the reason why I frame things in a slightly provocative way around this question is because if we have the conversation about charters outside of the context of the systematic defunding and privatization of our schools, then it sounds like, oh, these are places where people are coming together to solve problems that the public schools can't solve, without actually talking about why the public schools can't solve those problems, right? And so there's this strange phenomenon that has been set up where it's like, in public schools, there's rigidity, there's no creativity, and things have to go like this. But charters give us lots of flexibility and options, right? When there's literally no reason why public schools couldn't have that same flexibility and options, right? And so it's a way of saying public schools are rigid and cannot be changed. The only way to change them is to create these kind of in-between organizations, which again, the reason why I call them private, just to be clear, y'all, charter schools are governed by privately organized bodies, like any nonprofit, right? They're not, no one who is in charge of a public school is democratically elected, right? And so if you put this inside of a frame around privatization, which I think we have to do, right? You can say, well, Duke University gets lots of public money, right? That doesn't make Duke University a public institution, right? What we think that the question about privatization revolves around is who gets to make choices, right? Who gets to make decisions? And the reality is like, yes, you can point to a small handful of charters that are doing some really interesting and provocative and productive things. And what the primary function that they are serving right now is to create a conversation about public schools can't be changed, public schools are failing, and you need to have this alternative. And we don't have the conversation of the economic impacts of that, because in Durham, right, where 20% of our kids have been siphoned off into charter schools, what it means is we don't just lose that $1 to $1, right? It's not just like the funds, you know, that kid would go to the charter school, because what school systems do is they save money on economies of scale, right? So when you are feeding more kids, when you are transporting more kids, when you're putting more kids in a building, the cost, right, you can actually see cost savings there. So when those dollars go out, it's not just those dollars, but there's an additional impact, sometimes of thousands of dollars per kid, that leaves the system and goes into a system that, again, if the body that governs that school decides it wants to provide EC services, decides it wants to provide transportation, decides it wants to provide food, then it can, but it doesn't have to. And we are taking resources out of the institution that has to do all those things, right? And so the way I think it's important to think about it is sort of like a foot in the door of privatization, right? And it's a way to create a conversation about school choice that doesn't talk about the context in which that choice is being made, right? So, and a lot of times the people who are pushing the charter agenda and the voucher agenda, because again, it's the same folks, right? We need to be really, really, really clear about that as well, is that there's no division between people who want more vouchers and people who are pushing for the expansion of charters in this country or in this state. They have an interest in that, right? And when they go into poor communities, particularly Black and brown communities, and they say to people, the public schools are failing your kids, you need more choices, you need more options, that's incredibly manipulative, because the reason that the public schools are failing their kids is because those public schools were set up to fail their kids in the first place, right? So it's kind of a circular argument that we feel like it's important to say some provocative things to knock it off its center and have a slightly different conversation about what it means.
I really appreciate that reframing of that. That was really helpful for me. Yeah, I'm gonna we have a few more minutes. I'm gonna say, Bryan, if you wanna leave us with a couple last thoughts, maybe even call to actions, how can we be taking stands and having conversations with people in our personal life, and also taking actions in our local government, state government? What can we be doing?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the cool things about public schools, right, again, because they're democratic, is that every year is an opportunity to engage in a conversation in a public way, in a conversation about what's happening in our schools. So in every county right now, they're having conversations about the school board's budget. And then the school board, once they approve that budget, is going to take it to the county commission. And in most counties in this state, both because of the relative lack of resources in that county and the relatively conservative nature of county commissions, right? You see county commissions that it is very, very difficult to get them to put additional resources into schools. And so what we're in the midst of right now is you have a state government that's underfunded schools for 10 years and kind of kicks that emphasis down to the county level. And so what you see in lots of y'all's communities right now, I know in Durham right now, our folks are advocating to get a nurse in every single school, right? And so there's an opportunity to advocate for that, to get the school board to fund, to propose that budget, but then to help people go to the county commission and say, no, we need funding for that, right? In particular, right, in the response to the pandemic, everyone's saying, we gotta be in public schools, our kids are having these mental health crises, right? But we don't have counselors or nurses or healthcare professionals. So I think that there's a lot of ways that people can both intervene in local budget processes, right? Move these conversations into local elections, and then also, past just acting on decision makers. I think there's also something about taking some of this perspective and bringing it into our daily conversations about public schools, right? When someone says, oh, the public schools, they're like this, right? Like, stop them and ask them, when was the last time they were in a public school? And what did they see happening there? Because I walk into public schools all the time and I see magical things happening, right? And I want to encourage folks to challenge people to actually dig in and take a more sophisticated kind of approach. Because yes, public schools are failing our kids, but actually the entire society is failing our kids. And really public schools are the last place that is trying to mitigate that failure, right?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bryan. Learned so much during this presentation. We're going to close out. I know it's at the top of the hour. Close out with our litany. I would also encourage, since we've had such an interactive presentation today, if you want to unmute yourself and respond in the bold, I invite you to. I'm going to close this out now. God of peace, you have shown yourself to us as one who demonstrated that true power looks like by refusing to use violence. We are willing
to follow your way of peace.
God of justice, you have invited us into peacemaking work by showing us that justice is the first ingredient.
We are willing to work your way of justice.
God of righteousness, you have provided the means for all creation to flourish when we walk your righteous path.
We are willing to
To be righteous people.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you all at our 1 p.m. last legislative seminar of the week. Have a great day.